the night God destroyed 185,000 soldiers. Night had fallen over Jerusalem. Inside the ancient stone walls, fear spread through the narrow streets like a cold wind. Families whispered in their homes. Soldiers stood quietly along the city walls, staring into the darkness beyond the gates. Because outside those walls, an army waited. An army so massive that the earth seemed to shake beneath it. The terrifying forces of Sennacherib, ruler of the mighty Assyrian Empire, had arrived. Where this army marched, cities fell. Kingdoms burned. Nations disappeared. The Assyrians were known across the ancient world for their brutality. Their soldiers were relentless. Their conquests unstoppable. And now, they surrounded Jerusalem. Inside the city, the people knew the truth. They could not win. Their army was small. Their defenses were weak. Their enemy numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Outside the walls, Assyrian commanders mocked the people of Judah. They laughed at their faith. They shouted insults toward the city and toward the God the people believed would protect them. "Do not let your king deceive you," they yelled. "No God has ever saved a nation from the king of Assyria." The words echoed across the valley. Fear gripped the city. But inside the palace, King Hezekiah did something unexpected. Instead of surrendering, instead of negotiating, he went to the temple, and he prayed. That night, while the people of Jerusalem waited in silence, something happened in the Assyrian camp. Something no army could prepare for. Something no king could control. Because before the sun would rise again, before a single sword was lifted in battle, the most powerful army in the world would suffer a catastrophe so shocking that history would remember it for thousands of years. By morning, 185,000 soldiers would be dead. Long before the night that would shake history, a shadow had already begun spreading across the ancient world. That shadow was the unstoppable rise of the Assyrian Empire. For generations, this empire had built its reputation through war, discipline, and fear. Its kings believed their destiny was to dominate every nation under heaven. Their armies were not simply soldiers. They were machines of conquest. Cities that resisted them were destroyed. Walls were torn down. Kings were humiliated. Entire populations were marched away into exile. Stories of Assyrian brutality traveled faster than their armies. By the time their banners appeared on the horizon, many cities surrendered immediately because they knew what would happen if they refused. At the center of this terrifying empire ruled a powerful king, Sennacherib. He was not only a ruler, he was a conqueror obsessed with power. When he inherited the throne, he continued the campaign of expansion his father had begun. Nation after nation fell before him. Records carved into Assyrian stone tablets proudly listed the cities he had destroyed and the kings he had defeated. To Sennacherib, every victory proved one thing: no God could stop Assyria. And eventually, his ambition turned toward a small kingdom that dared to resist him. That kingdom was Judah. It was not large. It was not powerful. But it had something that angered the king of Assyria: defiance. Years earlier, Judah had been forced to submit to Assyrian rule and pay heavy tribute. Silver, gold, and precious resources were sent to Assyria to keep the empire satisfied. But then something changed. A new king rose in Judah. His name was Hezekiah. Unlike many kings before him, Hezekiah refused to follow the corrupt traditions that had spread through the land. When he took the throne, he began one of the most dramatic spiritual reforms in the history of Judah. Temples dedicated to false gods were destroyed. Idols were torn down. Sacred pillars used in pagan worship were broken. Even an ancient bronze serpent that people had begun worshiping, an object originally connected to the time of Moses, was smashed because the people had turned it into an idol. Hezekiah declared that the people must return to the worship of the true God alone. For many in Judah, it was a moment of hope. For Assyria, it was rebellion. Hezekiah also made a dangerous political decision. He stopped paying tribute to the Assyrian Empire. It was a bold act, one that could only end in two ways: freedom or destruction. At first, nothing happened. Years passed, but empires never forget rebellion. Eventually, the day arrived when Sennacherib decided to respond. His army began moving south. Like a storm rolling across the land, the Assyrian war machine crushed city after city in Judah. Fortified towns that had stood for generations were destroyed in a matter of days. One of the most famous battles occurred at the city of Lachish. Lachish was Judah's second most important city after Jerusalem. It was heavily fortified and strategically vital. But even Lachish could not withstand Assyria. Archaeological carvings discovered in Assyria centuries later show the terrifying siege of the city. Assyrian soldiers built massive ramps against the walls. Archers fired endless arrows. Battering rams smashed the gates. Eventually, the city fell. The destruction was brutal. And with Lachish defeated, only one city remained standing against Assyria: Jerusalem, the capital, the heart of Judah. Sennacherib believed the fall of Jerusalem would be the final proof of his power. If the capital collapsed, Judah would be erased from history like so many nations before it. So the king sent his commanders toward the city. Among them was a powerful Assyrian official known as the Rabshakeh, a spokesman for the king who specialized in psychological warfare. Standing before the walls of Jerusalem, he shouted loudly so everyone could hear. He mocked the people. He mocked their king. And most dangerously, he mocked their God. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you," he shouted. "Do not believe him when he says the Lord will deliver you." Then he listed nation after nation that Assyria had already conquered. "Where are the gods of those lands?" he asked. "Did any of them rescue their people from the king of Assyria?" The message was clear. Your God cannot save you. Inside Jerusalem, the people heard every word. Fear began spreading through the city. They had seen what happened to the other cities of Judah. They knew what the Assyrian army was capable of. And now that same army stood just outside their walls. Many wondered if surrender might be the only way to survive. But Hezekiah did something unexpected. When the king heard the report of the Assyrian threats, he did not respond with anger or military plans. Instead, he tore his clothes in grief. He covered himself with sackcloth, a sign of humility before God. Then he went to the temple. There he prayed. But he also sent messengers to a man who had guided the nation for many years. A prophet whose words carried authority and hope. That man was Isaiah. The message from the king was simple. This is a day of trouble, and we have no strength left. But Isaiah returned with a surprising answer. He told the king not to fear the words of the Assyrian commanders, because God himself had heard the insults spoken against him, and God would respond. Still, outside the city walls, the situation looked hopeless. The Assyrian army continued preparing for battle. Thousands of soldiers filled the valleys around Jerusalem. Tents stretched across the landscape. Campfires burned through the night. Weapons were sharpened. War machines stood ready. To human eyes, the outcome seemed certain. Jerusalem would fall, but heaven was watching. And the God whom Assyria had mocked was about to demonstrate a power that no empire on earth could challenge. The night that would change everything was approaching. The pressure on Jerusalem grew heavier with every passing day. From the city walls, the people could see the endless camps of the Assyrian Empire spread across the valleys like a sea of iron and fire. Tents filled the landscape. War banners waved in the wind. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers moved through the camp like a living machine of destruction. Every night the sound of marching feet, clashing armor, and distant war chants echoed across the hills. The message was clear. Jerusalem was surrounded. There was no escape. Inside the city, fear gripped the people. Merchants closed their stalls early. Families gathered in their homes, whispering anxious prayers. Soldiers stood at the gates gripping their weapons, though deep inside many of them knew they could never defeat such a massive force. They had heard the stories. Every nation that had resisted the Assyrians had eventually fallen. And now the same fate seemed to be closing in on them. Outside the walls, the Assyrian commanders continued their psychological assault. The most vocal among them was the Rabshakeh, the chief spokesman of Sennacherib. Standing near the walls where the defenders could hear him clearly, he raised his voice and mocked the people of Judah. "Do not trust in your king," he shouted. "Do not believe Hezekiah when he tells you that your God will save you." The Rabshakeh spoke in the Hebrew language so that every person on the wall would understand. His goal was simple: break their spirit before the battle even began. He began listing all the nations Assyria had conquered. "Did the gods of those nations rescue them?" he asked loudly. "Where are the gods of Hamath? Where are the gods of Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim?" City after city, nation after nation, each one had been destroyed by the Assyrian army. Then he shouted the most dangerous statement of all. "Who among all the gods of these lands has been able to save his country from my hand? Why should your God be any different?" The words were not just an insult to Judah. They were a direct challenge to heaven. But the men standing on Jerusalem's walls said nothing. They had been given strict orders by King Hezekiah. Do not answer them. Do not argue. Do not respond. Silence was their only reply. Eventually, the Assyrian commanders returned to their camp. But the damage had already been done. The people were terrified. When the officials of Judah returned to the palace and reported everything they had heard, the atmosphere inside the royal court became heavy with fear. When Hezekiah heard the words spoken by the Assyrian messengers, he reacted in a way that shocked many around him. He tore his royal robes. The king of Judah removed the symbols of his power and dressed himself in sackcloth. It was a public sign of humility and grief. Then he went to the temple of God. At the same time, he sent trusted messengers to the prophet Isaiah. Their message carried the weight of the entire nation. This day is a day of trouble, they said, a day of rebuke and disgrace. It is like a child ready to be born, but the mother has no strength to deliver. In other words, Jerusalem had reached the edge of disaster. The king asked the prophet to pray, to ask God to hear the insults spoken by the Assyrian king, to ask heaven for help. When the message reached Isaiah, the prophet did not hesitate. His answer came quickly, and it carried a powerful promise. Do not be afraid, Isaiah said. Do not fear the words you have heard. The prophet explained that the insults spoken by the Assyrians had not only been directed at Judah, they had been directed at God himself. And God had heard every word. Isaiah then delivered a prophecy. The king of Assyria would not capture Jerusalem. He would not shoot an arrow into the city. He would not build siege ramps against its walls. Instead, something unexpected would happen. The Assyrian king would hear a report that would force him to leave. And eventually, he would die in his own land. It was a bold prophecy, but the reality outside the city still looked terrifying. Meanwhile, Sennacherib continued his campaign in the region, conquering other cities while preparing for the final attack on Jerusalem. From the battlefield, he sent another message to Hezekiah. This time it came in the form of a letter. The message was blunt and threatening. Do not let your God deceive you, the letter said. Do not believe that Jerusalem will escape my hand. Then the king repeated his argument. He listed the many nations Assyria had already destroyed. Did their gods rescue them? No. And your God will not rescue you either. When the letter arrived in Jerusalem, it was delivered directly to the king. The palace grew silent as Hezekiah read the message. This was no longer just a military threat. It was a challenge to the very power of God. Instead of responding with anger or sending a reply, the king did something remarkable. He took the letter and went to the temple. Inside the quiet courts of the temple, Hezekiah walked toward the presence of God. Then he spread the letter out before the Lord. It was a symbolic act, as if to say, God, you see this. You hear what they are saying about you. Then the king began to pray. His prayer was not long, but it was powerful. O Lord, God of Israel, he began. You alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You made heaven and earth. Hezekiah acknowledged something that the Assyrian king did not understand. Yes, Assyria had destroyed many nations. Yes, their gods had failed to save them. But those gods had not been real. They were idols made by human hands, objects of wood and stone. But the God of Israel was different. He was the living God. Hezekiah then made a request. Deliver us from his hand. Then all the kingdoms of the earth will know that you alone are God. The king's prayer was not only about survival. It was about the glory of God, about proving that heaven ruled over every empire on earth. And somewhere beyond human sight, that prayer was heard, because the night of judgment was coming, a night when no sword would be raised, no army would charge, no battle would take place. Yet one of the greatest armies in history would fall in a single night. The valley outside Jerusalem was about to become the stage for one of the most mysterious and terrifying events recorded in the Bible. Night slowly settled over the hills surrounding Jerusalem. The sun disappeared behind the rocky ridges, and darkness spread across the valleys where the army of the Assyrian Empire had established its massive camp. From the walls of the city, the people of Jerusalem could see the glow of thousands of fires. The Assyrian soldiers were confident. Why wouldn't they be? Their king, Sennacherib, had crushed countless nations before this moment. Kingdoms stronger than Judah had already fallen. Cities larger than Jerusalem had already burned. To them, this siege was simply another inevitable victory. Inside their camp, Soldiers sharpened their weapons and told stories of past conquests. Some laughed, some drank, others slept peacefully, believing that by the next day the city would belong to them. Meanwhile, inside Jerusalem, the atmosphere was completely different. Fear hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Families gathered together in their homes, whispering prayers in the dim light of oil lamps. Mothers held their children tightly. Fathers stared toward the city walls, wondering if they would survive the coming battle. The soldiers on the walls looked out at the enormous enemy camp below. Even the bravest among them felt the weight of the moment. They were outnumbered beyond imagination. Humanly speaking, their defeat seemed certain. Yet something had changed that day. Their king, Hezekiah, had prayed. Not just a desperate prayer of fear, but a prayer that placed the entire situation into the hands of God. And the prophet Isaiah had already spoken. God had heard the insults. God had seen the threats. And God had promised that Jerusalem would not fall. Still, the people did not know how that promise would come true. There was no visible army coming to rescue them. No powerful allies marching toward the city. Only silence and darkness. The hours of the night passed slowly. In the Assyrian camp, thousands of soldiers fell asleep under the open sky. Their armor lay beside them. Their weapons rested near their hands. The valley was filled with quiet breathing and the occasional crackle of dying campfires. Everything seemed calm. Everything seemed normal. But something unseen was moving. Scripture records the moment with a single powerful sentence. During that night, the angel of the Lord went out. The Bible does not describe the exact details of what happened. There are no long explanations. No dramatic description of thunder or battle. Only a statement of what occurred. The angel of the Lord passed through the Assyrian camp. And when morning came, 185,000 soldiers were dead. No human sword had struck them. No army had attacked them. The most powerful military force in the region had been destroyed in a single night by the power of God. Some scholars believe this event may have been carried out by a divine messenger described as the angel of the Lord, a mysterious figure who appears several times in the Bible to carry out God's judgment or protection. Others simply acknowledge what the Bible states clearly. God intervened. Outside the city walls, the silent valley became a place of unimaginable devastation. Thousands of soldiers who had gone to sleep expecting victory would never wake again. Their weapons remained untouched. Their tents stood exactly where they had been placed. But the soldiers themselves were lifeless. The mighty army that had terrified the ancient world had been stopped without a battle. Meanwhile, inside Jerusalem, the people slept through the night, not fully knowing what had happened outside their walls. The city remained quiet. No alarms were sounded. No invasion came. And as the first light of dawn began to rise over the hills, the truth slowly revealed itself. Guards standing on the walls began looking toward the Assyrian camp. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then they noticed something strange. There was no movement, no marching soldiers, no morning preparations. The camp looked still, too still. As the sunlight grew stronger, the horrifying reality became clear. Bodies lay across the ground, thousands of them. The once mighty Assyrian army had become a silent field of death. Panic spread among the surviving soldiers. Those who were still alive fled the camp in terror. They abandoned their weapons. They abandoned their supplies. They ran for their lives. The siege of Jerusalem was over before it had even begun. When news reached Sennacherib, the proud conqueror who had mocked the God of Israel, the shock must have been overwhelming. The king who believed no God could stop him had just witnessed the destruction of his army in a single night. With no choice left, Sennacherib ordered a retreat. The mighty king returned to his capital city of Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian Empire. The invasion had failed. Jerusalem still stood, and the prophecies spoken by Isaiah had been fulfilled exactly. The Assyrian king had not entered the city. He had not shot an arrow into it. He had not built siege ramps against its walls. Instead, he had turned back the way he came. For the people of Jerusalem, the event became one of the greatest miracles in their history. It proved something powerful. Their safety did not come from military strength. It did not come from political alliances. It came from the power of the God they served. The same God whom the Assyrians had mocked. The same God whom Hezekiah had trusted in prayer. But the story of Sennacherib was not over yet, because the prophecy spoken earlier would eventually reach its final fulfillment. The king who once stood proudly against God would one day face a tragic end. And when that moment arrived, history would remember that even the greatest kings are still powerless before the authority of heaven. The road back to Nineveh was long and silent. For the soldiers who survived the mysterious disaster outside Jerusalem, the journey must have felt like walking through a nightmare. Only days earlier, they had marched with confidence behind the banners of the unstoppable Assyrian Empire. Their king, Sennacherib, had promised another victory, another city to conquer, another nation to add to the empire. But everything had changed in a single night. No battle, no siege, no heroic defense by the people of Jerusalem. Instead, an invisible force had swept through the camp. By morning, 185,000 soldiers lay dead. The survivors had no explanation. Some whispered about a curse. Others spoke quietly of the God of Israel, the very God their commanders had mocked only days earlier. Whatever the reason, one truth was impossible to ignore. The army that had terrified the world had been defeated without a fight. When Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, he did not celebrate this campaign the way he had celebrated others. In fact, Assyrian historical records, carved into massive stone prisms, tell the story of this invasion very differently. They boast about the cities of Judah that had been conquered. They describe how Hezekiah had been trapped like a bird in a cage inside Jerusalem. But strangely, they never claim that Jerusalem was captured. The reason is obvious. Because it wasn't. For an empire that recorded its victories with pride, the silence about the destruction of their army speaks louder than any admission of defeat. Years passed. Sennacherib continued ruling his empire from the grand palaces of Nineveh. His city was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Massive walls surrounded it. Palaces decorated with intricate carvings displayed scenes of his victories. Foreign ambassadors brought tribute. Merchants filled the markets. To many people across the empire, Sennacherib still appeared powerful and unstoppable. But the prophecy spoken by Isaiah had not been forgotten. Long before the Assyrian king returned home, Isaiah had delivered a message from God. He had said that Sennacherib would return to his own land. And there, something would happen. The prophecy declared that the king who mocked God would eventually fall by the sword in his own country. At first, nothing seemed to change. Years passed quietly. The king continued to rule. But pride has a way of planting seeds of destruction that grow slowly over time. One day, inside the temple of the Assyrian god Nisroch, Sennacherib came to worship. It should have been a place of safety, a place of power, but it became the place where his story ended. According to the biblical record, while the king was inside the temple, two of his own sons attacked him. Their names were Adramelech and Sharezer. In a shocking act of betrayal, they assassinated their own father. The mighty king of Assyria, the man who had once threatened to destroy Jerusalem, was killed by his own family. The assassins fled the land immediately after the attack. Another son of Sennacherib, named Esarhaddon, eventually took the throne and continued ruling the empire. But the fate of Sennacherib had already proven something important. Power cannot protect a person from the consequences of pride. The king who once mocked the God of Israel had ended his life in humiliation. Meanwhile, far to the south, Jerusalem continued to stand. The people of Judah remembered the night when their city had been saved without a single sword being raised. They remembered the courage of Hezekiah, who had chosen prayer instead of surrender. They remembered the prophecy of Isaiah, who had spoken with confidence even when the situation looked hopeless. But most importantly, they remembered the power of the God who had defended them. For generations afterward, parents would tell the story to their children. They would describe the terrifying army that surrounded Jerusalem. They would describe the mocking voices that claimed no God could save the city. And then they would describe the night when heaven moved. A night when 185,000 soldiers fell. A night when the most powerful empire on earth discovered that human pride cannot stand against divine authority. But the story was never meant to be only about ancient history. It was meant to teach something deeper. Because the lesson of that night still echoes through time. Empires rise. Empires fall. Kings boast of their strength. Armies march across the earth. But above every throne and every kingdom stands a greater authority. The God who rules heaven and earth. The same God who heard the prayer of Hezekiah. The same God who defended Jerusalem without a battle. And the same God who still reminds the world today. That pride may rise for a moment. But in the end, humility before God is the only path that truly stands. The story of the night when 185,000 soldiers fell is not simply a dramatic moment in ancient history. It is a window into something much deeper. A lesson about power, pride, faith, and the mysterious ways God moves when people believe they are completely surrounded. The kingdom of Judah was never the strongest nation in the ancient world. It did not have the massive armies of the Assyrian Empire. It did not possess the endless wealth of powerful empires. And when the army of Sennacherib surrounded Jerusalem, the situation looked hopeless. From a human perspective, the outcome seemed certain. Jerusalem should have fallen just like the other cities of Judah. But something different happened. Instead of trusting military strength alone, Hezekiah chose a path that many leaders would never consider. He humbled himself. He prayed. When the king received the threatening letter from Assyria, he did not hide it or ignore it. He carried it directly into the temple and laid it before God. That moment revealed something powerful about faith. Faith is not pretending problems do not exist. Faith is bringing those problems honestly before God. Hezekiah did not deny the danger. He did not pretend the Assyrian army was small. He simply recognized that the power of God was greater than the power of any empire. Another important lesson comes from the insults spoken by the Assyrian commanders. They mocked the God of Israel because they believed every god was the same. To them, gods were simply statues made of wood or stone. They had already defeated many nations, and the gods of those nations had not stopped them. So they assumed the God of Israel would be just another powerless idol. But they made one critical mistake. The God of Israel was not an idol. He was the creator, and history would soon remind them of that truth. The prophet Isaiah played a crucial role in this story as well. While fear spread through Jerusalem, Isaiah delivered a message of calm confidence. He did not deny the threat of Assyria, but he reminded the people that God had already heard the insults spoken against him, and God had already decided how the story would end. Sometimes the most powerful voice during a crisis is not the loudest one. It is the one that speaks truth when everyone else is afraid. Isaiah's prophecy seemed almost impossible when he first spoke it. The enemy army still surrounded the city. Nothing had changed yet. But faith often requires trusting a promise before the evidence appears. And then came the night that changed everything. The Bible describes it briefly but powerfully. During that night, the angel of the Lord passed through the Assyrian camp. By morning, 185,000 soldiers were dead. No battle, no siege, no long war, just one night. This moment reminds readers that God's power does not depend on human strength. God does not need a massive army to accomplish his purposes. One divine command can change the course of history. The destruction of the Assyrian army also exposed the weakness of pride. The empire that had mocked God discovered that human arrogance can collapse in an instant. The same king who believed no God could stop him was forced to retreat back to Nineveh in humiliation. Eventually, the prophecy spoken by Isaiah was fulfilled completely. The king who had threatened Jerusalem died in his own land, just as the prophet had foretold. For the people of Judah, the event became a reminder that faith can survive even the darkest moments. When the enemy seems overwhelming, when the situation feels impossible, when fear spreads through an entire nation, God is still able to act. Another lesson from this story is about perspective. From the walls of Jerusalem, the Assyrian army looked unstoppable. From heaven's perspective, that army was only temporary. Human power always appears permanent while it is rising. But history shows that every empire eventually fades. The Assyrian Empire, once feared across the entire region, eventually disappeared from history. Its cities became ruins. Its kings became names in ancient records. But the story of Jerusalem's deliverance continued to be told for thousands of years. Not because Judah was powerful, but because their deliverance revealed something about the character of God. He hears prayers. He defends those who trust him. And he reminds the world that even the greatest powers on earth are still subject to his authority. The story also challenges every generation to ask an important question. Where do we place our trust? Do we trust only in human strength, in money, influence, or political power? Or do we recognize that true security ultimately comes from God? The people of Jerusalem did not win that victory through military skill. They won it through faith, through humility, through prayer, and through a king who believed that the God of Israel was greater than the strongest empire on earth. The night when 185,000 soldiers fell still echoes through history as a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with swords, but with faith. History remembers many wars. It remembers powerful kings, massive armies, and legendary battles. But the night when God destroyed 185,000 soldiers outside Jerusalem is different from every other war story. Because no battle actually happened. No swords clashed. No soldiers charged into combat. The army of the Assyrian Empire, the most feared military force of its time, simply collapsed in a single night. And the people inside Jerusalem did nothing but trust God. That is what makes this story unforgettable. When Sennacherib surrounded the city, everything looked impossible. From a human perspective, the outcome seemed obvious. A small nation like Judah could never defeat an empire that had already conquered so many lands. But the story reminds us that history is not controlled only by kings and armies. There is another authority above them all, the God who hears prayers. When Hezekiah spread the threatening letter before God in the temple, he was doing something simple yet powerful. He was admitting that the situation was beyond human strength. And sometimes that is exactly where miracles begin. Many people today face moments that feel similar to what Jerusalem experienced that night. Situations where the problem looks too large. The pressure feels overwhelming. And every voice around them says defeat is inevitable, just like the voices outside Jerusalem's walls. But the story recorded by the prophet Isaiah reminds us that the final word does not belong to fear. It belongs to God. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not fight harder. It is to trust deeper. Because there are battles that human strength cannot win, but they are never beyond God's power. The people of Jerusalem went to sleep that night, not knowing what God was about to do. They woke up to discover that their greatest enemy had already been defeated. In the same way, many answers to prayer happen quietly, in ways people do not see until later. The night outside Jerusalem became a reminder for every generation that follows. God is able to change situations that look completely impossible. Empires may rise, kings may boast, armies may march, but none of them stand above the authority of God. And sometimes, the greatest victories happen in the quiet hours of the night, when heaven moves in ways the world cannot see. So the question this story leaves with us is simple. When life surrounds you like that Assyrian army once surrounded Jerusalem, where will you place your trust?